It is with great pleasure to welcome Joe Walsh onto the debut of Foreign Object. Joe is the former Republican U.S. Congressman from the great state of Illinois. Joe has a master's in public policy from the University of Chicago and has dedicated his life to service and limited government advocacy, and has also taught American government and American history at the Hebrew Theological College and at Oakton Community College. Elected to the United States Congress in 2010, Joe became one of the most outspoken and well-known Tea Party members of Congress. He served on the Small Business Committee, the Committee on Homeland Security, and the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. Today, he is a highly popular conservative radio talk show host on Chicago's AM 560 and New York's AM 970. For more of Joe's work, you can find him at his website at walshfreedom.com. Now, in case you missed it already, Joe is so far right-wing that he can almost see fascism from his backyard, which all goes well for today's show, given I'm so far left I can almost see socialism from mine. So today we're going to talk about how we can get America back on its feet. In other words, what is the prescription to create jobs, broaden the middle class, deal with poverty and income inequality, and so on. So let's get started. Okay, full disclosure here. I've been a relentless basher of the Tea Party for the past few years. And I have to admit, it's mostly because you guys make it so easy to write jokes about you. Especially when your supporters hold placards reading, "Keep your big government hands off my Social Security." And then there's the whole endless wacky conspiracy stuff from Obama is a Kenyan Marxist, wasn't born in the United States, and so forth. But in all fairness, what I like about Tea Party Republicans is that they're angry for all the right reasons. They're angry that wages have stagnated, that their retirement savings have evaporated, that well-paying jobs have disappeared, that there seems to be one rule for the rich and another for the middle class. They get it because they feel the pain. But from where I stand as a foreign object, they blame the wrong circumstances for their plight. They blame the government instead of casino capitalism. They blame immigrants for taking their jobs instead of free trade that has outsourced their jobs to China and Mexico. They blame collective bargaining for low wages instead of blaming the corporate influence over Washington. And instead of blaming increasing hurricane velocity and climate change, they blame it on gay sex. So Joe, that's enough about me and what I have to say. What's your response to that?
Hey CJ, I'm honored to be with you on your debut program. This is great, man. I really appreciate it. You and I may not agree on a lot of issues, but actually maybe we do. I don't know. Yep. Yeah, I'm a crazy Tea Party former congressman, and let's just get the discussion going. I believe, CJ, that it's no longer Republican versus Democrat in this country. I think both parties are almost of the same mind. I think there's sort of like a revolution going on in the country right now. People who believe in freedom and limited government versus people who believe in big government. I think that's the real fight, and I think both parties kind of skew toward big government. They both have their favorite programs. What do you think?
Well, I could almost kiss you for saying that, Joe. I believe that, I'm done with this two-party system. I believe that the Democrats are totally beholden to Wall Street, in much the same way the Republicans are totally beholden in Wall Street. But what you just said then is you were blaming government, where I guess the difference right now is I blame our corporate overlords and the corporate overreach and the buyout of politicians by corporations. So I think we're almost on the same page, but we're still seeing it from a different problem. You're blaming government, I'm blaming the extensive power and reach and influence of big money.
You're right, CJ, and I think they're almost one in the same. I think and you're right, there are oddballs and whack jobs in every movement, so the Tea Party's got their share of oddballs and whack jobs. But I think generally the Tea Party believes government's too big, we have too big of a debt, we need most people to begin to take care of their own lives. And so we rail against welfare programs. But you're right, we don't rail as much against corporate welfare, which is as big or even bigger a problem. To your point, CJ, I think big government and big business are joined at the hip.
Okay. Explain that more. Give an example.
Well, it doesn't matter, and I often said this when I was in Congress, it doesn't matter if the president is Obama or Bush, Goldman Sachs, pick your investment bank, they're going to have instant access to that White House. I saw it up close and personal, CJ, when I was in Congress. The higher you move up in Congress, the more you become almost a pawn of, and you almost belong to special interests, whether they be big business on the Republican side. And truthfully, powerful Democrats in Congress are beholden to big business lobbyists as well. But no matter what party you are, the longer you're in Congress, the more you sort of become beholden to these special interests. And then away you go. You just continue to grow government because you want your piece of the pie, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Now, when you were in Congress, how overt were lobbyists in approaching you, lobbyists representing big corporate interests, in approaching you to push their agenda, and as far as offering campaign finance and so forth?
Yeah, it's CJ. I suppose it's not like the old days where they could be very overt, but it's understood that if you support them, I mean, they try to educate you on what their interests are, and it's certainly understood if you support their interests, well, then separately they'll support your reelection. Now, again, I got to be straight with you, though, CJ. Big business does this. The teachers union does this. I mean, you name it. Pick your special interest group. They all do the same. Generally, special interest. I was a Tea Party conservative libertarian congressman, so certain special interest groups wouldn't approach me. They tend to approach people who are already predisposed to what they want.
Yep, exactly. I heard a good analogy spoken, and it was spoken by one of Abrahoff's. Is that how you pronounce his name? Abrahoff?
Yeah, Abrahoff.
Yeah. And one of his lackeys or one of his guys, and he said, and I can't remember if I read this in an interview or I heard it in a speech, and he said whenever a new U.S. congressman came to D.C., we would meet with him in his office and we would say the following words: when your job is done here as a politician in Congress, you'll have a job with us. And if they nodded their head in agreement, we knew from that moment on we had them. What do you say to that?
Yeah, and CJ, that's probably true. And look, I knew a number of Republicans and Democrats in Congress who certainly behaved that way. Now, I will say again, in defense of the Tea Party, I went there along with a number of my Tea Party congressmen, and big business didn't like us because I wanted to cut corporate welfare. I wanted to cut loopholes for the big oil companies. I wanted to cut government everywhere. So generally, a lot of the big business lobbyists wanted nothing to do with some of the real principled Tea Party congressmen.
Yep, but what you said there is you want to cut government where you find it, but you're not talking about cutting corporate influence where you find it, and that's the problem that I see as a liberal, is that if you look at you're obviously familiar with Supreme Court Justice Powell in the 70s, and he was instrumental in bringing the greatest economic collapse in America's history, the second greatest economic crisis in America's history, in the form of the Great Recession in 2008. The greatest crash in American history, or the greatest financial crash in American history, was the Great Depression. Now, I believe our response, what upsets me, I guess, is where I see Tea Party Republicans going wrong. Again, I said they're angry for the right reasons. But instead of looking at the measures we put in place as a response to the Great Depression, which was strong social and economic reform, we implement, FDR put in the SEC, he launched Social Security, which has been proven to be the best government initiative ever for preventing poverty. And he also enacted massive labour reforms to protect the American worker. Now, factually, consider that from 1949 to 1979, which is the FDR New Deal era, the productivity of the American worker grew by 96.9%, while the hourly compensation of the average worker grew equally by 93.7%. So in short, management, shareholders and workers shared corporate profits equally, while the average American worker felt they were receiving their fair share of the nation's growth. Now, once Powell brought corporate America to Washington, we've now had to flip. So if you look at the period from Reagan's inauguration in 1980 to 2010, the productivity of the US worker has risen 80%, but the wage of the average American worker has only risen 4.2%. And before I get you to comment, I'll just quote Paul Krugman, who's a Nobel laureate, economist, and Paul Krugman says, quote, "The middle-class society I grew up in didn't evolve gradually or automatically. It was created in a remarkably short period of time by FDR and the New Deal. In the period 1940 to 1970, working Americans saw unprecedented gains." So what do you say to that?
Hey, CJ, here's what I'd say. Again, in my 2 years in Congress, I probably spoke to over 200 small business owners in this country. And like I know, small businessmen and women, not big business, they create 2/3 of the jobs, almost 3/4 of the jobs in this country. And I asked them repeatedly why they're not hiring people. And by the way, they're still not hiring people. And their answer was always the same. My taxes are too high. I'm regulated to death, and this government debt scares the hell out of me. So I don't know why, if you want to improve the lives of people in the middle class in this country, that's got to begin and end with a job. And right now that's fundamentally changed, I'd say, CJ, because we have a government that truthfully is north of $100 trillion in debt. Now, you may love, and I may love, I don't, but I'll play with you. Let's say we love all these government programs. We can't afford them. We've got almost 11,000 people retiring every day in this country, CJ. Yep. We're living longer, and we're living healthier. How are you going to pay for all of that? Something's got to give, and it's just not good enough to say, just keep increasing the size of government, and we can tax people more. You can't.
Absolutely. And again, I think we're almost on the same page here. I see small to middle size enterprises as the middle class. That's what they are. And it's the definition of somebody who is rich is a definition which has a lot of nuance. I mean, a doctor earning $400,000 per year in New York would hardly consider himself rich, but somebody living in Omaha earning $150,000 is probably flying a G6 now. The problem, but this is the problem, because the corporate influence on Washington, and the biggest fights in Washington, as you know, are always about the tax code, and we've shifted the tax burden from the middle class and small businesses, away from big corporations to small business and the middle class. America has had the biggest burden of the tax responsibility taken from the rich to the middle class, and that's where I'm upset.
You know how to put it back? Do you know how to reverse that?
Yep.
Simplify the tax code. Get rid of all these loopholes. Get rid of all these little tricks. Right now, the tax code, CJ, you know it, it benefits big business and wealthy individuals because they can pay for the accountants and the lawyers to find all the loopholes to come out paying nothing. Simplify the tax code, flatten the tax code, and you will get wealthy people in this country paying more.
Exactly. And that's, Joe, so why aren't you blaming the corporations, corporate influence over Washington rather than big government?
Well, I blame both. You're right. Big business doesn't want to simplify the code, but let's be honest, a lot of liberal, progressive interests don't want to do that as well. I'd love a simple flat tax in this country. And you and I could probably play around.
Hello, you there, Joe?
Hey, CJ?
Yep. You there?
I lost you. I'm back.
Okay, good. Yeah, got you there.
So that you want to simplify the tax code and get rid of all of this crap that's in the tax code that only rich people can take advantage of. You're going to fight big business, and you're going to fight the left, because they don't want to do anything that might be perceived to be lowering tax rates for the wealthy, which is part of what we should do, and they'll end up paying more.
Yeah, but the problem here is that, and you're right, I'm not sure if I understand the point that liberals are trying to not make the rich pay more in taxes, but small business, if we look, small business are paying a higher percentage of their revenue to the federal government because they don't have the loopholes. They don't have corporate lobbyists in Washington. Now, and
they're taxed as individuals.
And they're taxed as individuals, correct. One of the problems is that you'll hear, my biggest gripes, I often hear Republicans say, and it's a talking point by every Republican candidate, it's a talking point on Fox News, that America is has one of the highest corporate tax rates in the modern world. On paper, that is true, but in reality, it's patently false. In fact, after all the loopholes are taken into consideration, loopholes which are written by corporate lobbyists with their influence over Washington politicians, corporations in this country pay almost the lowest percentage of their revenue to the federal government compared to other countries. In fact, we pay a lower percentage to the federal government than what corporations in Mexico do. Whilst the on-paper tax rate is 35%, the effective rate, the real rate, which is the rate corporations pay after all these loophole deductions, is closer to 12%. And in fact, companies like big oil and gas and so forth pay as little as 3.8% of their revenue to taxes.
Well, and actually, CJ, I'll fight you on this. We won't get into it, but even the studies I've seen, the real rate, on paper it's the highest, but the real rate, we're still the highest. It's somewhere between 23 and 25%, but you and I can compare our studies on that. Look, I agree with you. Small business are taxed as individuals, and right now they're dying. They're overtaxed. We've got to lower the individual rate in this country as well. The problem, CJ, the problem is, look, the bigger the government, right, the more lobbyists you're going to have. If you make this machine really big, you're going to have more people trying to suck off of that machine and get theirs. Well, that's why they kind of go together. We've got to limit and shrink government so that we don't have such a vibrant lobbying class.
But how does shrinking government kill the lobbying class? I'm not sure what you mean by that.
Well, because government has gotten so big, what are lobbyists? Lobbyists are people, special interest groups, who just use and suck off of government to get what they can get out of government. And the more programs you create and the more you put into each program, the more opportunities you have for lobbyists to get a piece of that, to lobby for a piece of that. Look, if you chart the growth of the federal government, you will see a direct correlation between that and the growth of the lobbying class in this country. They're one and the same.
Well, okay. Corporations at the moment are sitting on... Corporations have never had it so good in America's history. They're sitting on a record $3 trillion cash reserve. Their profits are off the charts. But that profit isn't being shared with the American worker. And that was what I was alluding to before when I showed the difference between productivity and the share of the worker income from 1949 to 79 compared to 1980 to 2010. Now, while these corporations are so wealthy, we have these corporate lobbyists putting pressure, particularly on Republican elective representatives, to keep the minimum wage income low, to keep a repeal of the estate tax, and so forth. So whilst the rich are getting richer, and while 95% of all income gains are traveling to the top 1%, the middle class is being shrunk and decimated by these uber right-wing capitalistic...
But here, CJ, what's your solution? What is your answer to that? The wealthiest people in this country should pay what effective tax rate?
Well, I mean, certainly more than 12%. which is what the effective tax rate is.
Should we go back to when Reagan got elected, 70, 80, 90%?
Well, I'll put it this way. When a Republican was the president in the 1950s, his name was President Eisenhower.
Absolutely.
And the top effective tax rate when he was president was 91%.
Do you want to go back to that?
Wait a second, let me finish. But Eisenhower said, quote, that it would be immoral and completely against America's interests to lower the top effective tax rate from 91%.
Well, and again, I would say to you, CJ, that if guys like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and John Adams were around right now, and they understood that right now most American people do not get to keep half of what they earn, Jefferson, Adams, and Madison would revolt against their government right now. The average American does not get to keep, I'm not just talking about the rich people, the average American doesn't get to keep half of what they make. Our founders would have revolted against that.
I agree. Absolutely. And that's why the burden has shifted from the rich to the middle class as far as the tax burden goes. It's absolutely absurd. And as Warren Buffett has said, that his secretary pays a bigger percentage of her income to the federal government than what he does.
But actually, and again, I don't love Warren Buffett. That's not true. That's not true.
In percentage-wise, that is true because he pays.
No, it's not.
He pays his income on capital gains. He's got almost the Mitt Romney exemption, which was a law written into the tax code by hedge fund managers.
I know, but you know what, CJ? Again, if you want to just focus on corporations and the wealthy, and I agree with you, big business right now, on average, is a negative influence on this country. But understand something. Right now, we have a government in this country we can't afford. And if we don't turn that around pretty quickly, future generations in this country, and I believe this, a lot of Tea Party believe this, will be bankrupt. That's the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mullen, said that's the greatest threat to this country is our debt. And it really, really is. We've got to do something about that.
Yeah, absolutely. But this is the problem. You look at the debt, as do, and I haven't heard a liberal that's not concerned with the rising debt. Once China stops buying our treasuries, once these oil Gulf states stop buying our dollars, America is heading for the biggest disaster. It doesn't even know the nightmare which is coming down the road. Let me finish the point. In addressing the debt, Tea Party Republicans in particular, and Republicans in the whole, you're only willing to look at one side of the equation, and it's government expenditure. You won't look at revenues. And corporations in this country are paying the least amount of their revenue to the federal government in America's history, and that's just a fact.
Well, all politicians, Republican and Democrat, when they talk about the debt, they're afraid to talk about what we need to talk about, which are the entitlements. 2/3 of the federal government money is spent on Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And again, CJ, Democrats don't want to touch this. And every time Republicans touch it, they get whacked over the head, so they're afraid to touch it. But unless this country gets their arms around the fact that we're living longer and longer and longer, there will be no Medicare. No, but that's the big enchilada. Look, I went to Congress and we tried to cut the government, and it was stupid. We just kept cutting this little piece of the pie. Republicans didn't want to cut defense, and Democrats didn't want to cut entitlements. And that's virtually the entire budget. We've got to have politicians who have the courage to cut and reform these programs, or they're not going to be around for our kids.
Yeah, but again, it's kind of that language kind of comes across to me as blame the victim. Blame the victims for the people who've lost the equity in their homes, who have lost their jobs because of casino capitalism, which has gone wild. We had the crash in 2008, which was due to insane leveraged. And all these, financial wizardry products, which, these phony derivatives and so forth, which would leverage to the rate of 72 to 1, which was never going to be sustainable. So while all these fat cats on Wall Street got rich, and the Lehman Brothers and so forth, and they crashed the entire universe, they got a bailout. But the average homeowner, the average worker, did not. And that's where my concern is. And then the language of Republicans scares me, because it's like, oh, well, you're people who are the victims of casino capitalism. You're not working hard enough. You've got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Find a job which really isn't there anymore. Your job's been outsourced to China, but try and make your mortgage working at McDonald's for $7 an hour. I think, you guys are ringing for the right reason, but you're not blaming the corporate influence and the Wall Street influence. You're blaming the lowest common denominator. You're punching down instead of punching up.
No, here's my problem, CJ. And I agree with you on a lot of the corporate stuff, but here's my problem. Take Medicare, which is the healthcare program for the elderly in this country. If we don't reform that program, it will be gone in 8 to 9 years. And then you're talking about average people, when they retire, not being able to access medical conversation and change that. I'm not blaming the victim. I want Medicare to be around for older people, but right now it won't be.
Yeah. Okay. And so, all right. And so on Obamacare, let's come to healthcare for a moment.
Yeah.
And we certainly know where Tea Party Republicans stand on Obamacare. You guys have shut down the government over it. You've said it's worse than slavery. We've heard all the sound bites. But of all the dire warnings that Tea Party Republicans have given over Obamacare, the reality that, your forecasts haven't come true. The cost of healthcare in this country is rising at its slowest rate in 60 years. We have 10 million more Americans that are now have coverage who never had it before. Now, I'll make this caveat. I don't like Obamacare. And the reason I don't like Obamacare is it's a free market solution. It was written by Republicans, the Heritage Foundation, and first implemented by a Republican governor, Mitt Romney. So it's your plan, and that's why I hate it. Obama ran on universal health care, and because of the power of the insurance lobby in Washington, Max Baucus, who was the head of the healthcare committee, sold out, flipped over. Obama sold out as well, and we ended up with this shitty government solution. It's not even a government solution, a shitty free market solution which forces Americans to buy bad products.
It's a mess, and you and I can agree on that for very different reasons. You and I do not like Obamacare. But here's the deal with
I'll quantify my remark. I like Obamacare better than what we had before, but it's still shit.
Okay. Yeah. The problem is, again, the country needs to make a decision when it comes to health care. Either go the single-payer route, or you've got to go the free market route and have government only there for people in need, because we cannot afford Obamacare or anything in the middle. It's just going to bankrupt us.
But, okay, it'll bankrupt us if we keep running up these $1 trillion deficits, and we'll keep continuing to have $1 trillion deficits while, again, we aren't having a growing middle class that can pay for taxes, and we don't have corporations and the elite class who are paying their fair share to pay it down.
CJ, you agree that we do need to cut back government to some degree, don't you?
Look, I believe that, yeah, absolutely. I think you start with the military. I'm
with you.
Yeah, and that's good we're on the same page, because most arguments will have Republicans, oh yeah, we've got to cut government spending, but no, the military, that's off the table. We're not touching that. I mean, that's the biggest expenditure of discretionary spending in the U.S. budget. So
defense and Social Security and Medicare, that's basically the whole federal budget. You're right. Look, some of the best moments I had in Congress was when I partnered with Dennis Kucinich on a number of bills to cut defense spending. There are Republicans that are willing to do that. Democrats need to be willing to cut the entitlements, or we're sunk.
Okay. Okay, but on Social Security, one of the I guess fabricated myth that it's perpetrated on the right is that Social Security is going bankrupt, that it's a Ponzi scheme. Social Security is running trillion-dollar surpluses, and it will eventually run a deficit in 25, 30 years down the road. But we need to reform the Social Security model because, again, lobbyists for the rich in Washington have put the cutout rate at $110,000. Or is it $110,000, $120,000? So it's ridiculous that people are paying more than that aren't paying more into Social Security. So I believe.
You give people, CJ, how about you give people the option of opting out of Social Security when they're younger?
Because
freedom? Freedom?
You know what we like when we're younger. We're idiots.
Tough. That's okay, CJ. In your 20s and 30s, how about you plan for your own retirement? We allow people who want to do that. That's freedom, CJ.
Okay, what if you're working 50 hours a week on $7 an hour and you're commuting 2 hours to work to a shitty job and you're commuting back home, you don't see your kids, you can barely afford to put groceries on the table? How does that person put money away for retirement?
I doubt that person, CJ, would opt out. All I'm saying is if we began to give Americans the choice, you would get some who would opt out. And Social Security would go back to what it should have been, which is the retirement program for those who need it. Somehow we got to get back to that.
Okay. All right. Let's move on then to taxes. Do you still subscribe to the debunked mythology of voodoo economics or Reagan economics or trickle-down economics, whatever you want to call it?
Oh, absolutely. The lower taxes are, the more growth you will create. And again, CJ, you and I can argue study after study, but here's what I believe. You give $1 to some business guy out here, generally the business guy out here is going to do better things with it than government will. So yes, the more that we can let the American people keep, the more I think they'll invest in things, they'll start businesses, they'll hire people. That's all to the good.
But that's been patently false, Joe. See what happens when
Not
you
at all.
when
Reagan
you get
and Kennedy, government revenues shot through the roof.
Okay, well let's look at Reagan in 1981. He made the biggest tax cut on the wealthy since World War II. And he sunk the economy into recession, and then had to raise taxes 3 more times throughout the length of his term. Bush enacted the greatest, his 2002 tax cut and 03 or 04 tax cut were the biggest tax cuts since Reagan. And we ended up with the worst job creation since World War II. And I'm going to quote.
Wait a second. Point, though, CJ.
Yep.
Government revenues. If you're just talking government revenues, in both cases, government revenues went up. They went up. Now, government spending went up in both cases as well. That's a problem.
Well, okay. Well, here's what the Economic Policy Institute found. The Bush tax cuts disproportionately benefited the wealthy. The top 0.1% of earners received an average tax cut of roughly more than 450 times larger than the share received by the average American middle-class family. The Bush cuts did little for low-income families. The Bush cuts never trickled down. The Bush cuts were poorly designed economic stimulus. The Bush cuts failed to create strong long-term growth. The Bush tax was so expensive they added to the debt. The Bush tax were much more expensive than advertised. The Bush tax cuts continue to be expensive. The Bush tax eliminated the most progressive federal taxes on larger states, and a decade of Bush tax cuts are increasing interest spending today.
And again, full disclosure, the Economic Policy Institute is a good, progressive think tank. I respect them, but they're left of center. I can give you a right of center think tank that'll say the exact opposite.
Yeah. Okay. So give me a 2-minute summation. Give me your stump speech, Joe. If you're running again in 2016. Give me what would your stump speech sound like?
Hey, CJ, thanks. And again, it's great to be with you. I really enjoyed discourse with you. Here's the deal. I am pissed off at both parties because both parties over the course of the last 100 years have gotten us to a point in this country where we are about to tip over and never ever recover. They've both become prisoners to big business, and they are on their way to bankrupting this country. I want to get back to a country that America was, by the way, when it was founded, where we had a very little government. We had a government that only took care of those people who could not take care of themselves. And everybody else was free to live their lives, make their money, and they were responsible for their own lives. I want to get back to that kind of America. By the way, that's what the Tea Party movement's all about. My problem is the Democrats don't believe in that America, and too many Republicans don't. They are both prisoners to big government, and as long as we stay on this path, America's never, ever, ever going to recover. And it's been great to be with you, CJ.
I appreciate that, Joe. And just to finish off, if I was running for Congress, which I'm forbidden to do, given I'm not given I'm not a fully fledged U.S. citizen, I believe that America needs to adopt the model. I know Europe is an anathema to anybody who's a conservative, but I believe that this country needs to move more towards what's happening in Western Europe, Scandinavia, Holland, Denmark, Germany, Australia, and so forth, where these countries are meeting the economic needs of their citizens, where wealth is shared between the middle class and the rich, and these countries have the least amount of income and wealth disparity. And according to the United Nations World Happiness Index, these countries are the most happiest. America is ranked 16th on the Social Progress Index and 17th in happiness behind Mexico. And we need to move to a model where our corporate overlords have less influence over Washington and where we can expand the middle class and go forward. So on many of these issues, I think you and I are looking at the problem. We see the same problem, and we're just coming from a slightly different angle, but this has been a fantastic discussion, Joe. I appeared on your show a couple of weeks ago, and you and I had a sensible discussion which could have easily descended into hyper-partisan rhetoric, but I think America's had enough of that. I think America wants real discussions on real solutions, and I thank you very much for your time.
Let's do it again. Thanks, CJ.
For sure, mate. Thanks, Joe. Great talking to you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, buddy.